What's the trashiest wedding you've been to? Some hippie friends of my parents got married when I was about 14. And it was a location wedding at some earthy little mountain getaway in Tennessee. Only it was outside and in mid-August. And in Tennessee that's like 90-degree, full humidity weather. But that's okay. Since it was so hot they decided to do it barefoot in a creek. Well, they had a cage of butterflies to release during the kiss. But as it turns out, they had all died because of the heat. When the big moment came, someone opened the cage dramatically to let them free and like 2 half-dead butterflies stumbled out and the rest were shriveled and dead inside. The hippie bride screamed in horror. The best man screwed the groom's mother between the meal and the dancing. The groom finds out and punches the best man, breaking his hand. The best man drives away and gets stopped by the police for drunk driving. Being a wedding photographer is awesome. My cousin who, let's say, isn't playing with a full deck and thought that she had hired a caterer because she sat at a bar one night and said to this lady, "You should do the food for my wedding." Waited until about an hour after the food should have logically arrived before starting to make some phone calls, only to find out that the caterer was on vacation in Costa Rica and had no idea that the bride thought she was doing food for the wedding. Domino's to the rescue about 2 hours later. But the reception being at a bowling alley with a keg in the middle of the dance floor was completely planned. I got this. Our nanny's best friend was getting married and my wife and I were invited because we had given that couple a bed and breakfast gift certificate we were not going to use, and they thought we should be at their wedding as a thank you. Okay, so the day come and we are sitting in a field on a farm on the hottest day of the year, high 90s. The bride is going to be transported from the house to the altar by horse-drawn carriage for about 2,000 feet away on a graded slanted dirt road. The signal for the carriage to head over is someone unbeknownst to us standing behind the seated guests, and they proceed to blast a 12-gauge stoggun as they all go. Horse rears up and freaks out. Handler trying to regain control and horse collapses. 10 minutes of what's going on we find out horse has heat stroke and cannot pull carriage. So, instead of foregoing the carriage, the bride's dad walks down to the wedding guest and asks for volunteers to help pull the carriage down to the altar. My wife nudges me and I say there is no way I am sticking my toe in that pool of dung. About 6 people volunteer including one midget. So they all get in place and start to pull the carriage, and as gravity and common sense come into play, the downgraded hill starts to make the carriage uncontrollable and the people start trying to control the speed, and within 45 seconds 6 guys are holding on for dear life running a full sprint just not to get run over if they let go, as they are almost in a full sprint cartoon style where their legs were going 100 mph but the cart was going faster. The midget at this point is not even touching the ground but his legs were still in running motion. I will never forget that visual. The carriage comes flying down the road and incredibly rolls by the grooves on the dirt road right into the hayfield and stops about 20 feet from the altar. It was quite literally the funniest thing I had ever seen. Then to put the icing on the cake, the reception was a non-alcoholic event as groom's family was super religious and it was a potluck dinner. We paid for their cake as our contribution for the potluck. My wife, being the saint she is, spent $600 on that thing, and the groom pushed the bride's face into it like an 8th grader giving a 6th grader a swirly in a bathroom stall and destroyed the whole thing. Not one piece was served. Oh, but how a store brand cola can hit the spot unlike a nice 7 and 7 on a hot summer's day. Dart total it show. Went to a wedding that my wife and I said will not last more than 2 years. The wedding was in the backyard of the bride's house. They had all the chairs and wedding arch set up outside. They set up a plastic tarp running down the aisle to walk on. Just before the wedding starts, there are darking clouds appearing. Should have been a sign to move the wedding inside, but they invited too many people to the damn thing. Just as they start the wedding, it begins to rain lightly. The father of the bride is walking the bride down the lane and slips on the wet tarp and falls on his ass. Bride is now at the front. Raining harder. People start to cover up with whatever they have. Some people start to get up too. Bride turns around and says to all, "This is my wedding. No one is going to ruin it. You better all ducking sit your asses down." We all sit back down and the wedding resumes. It is now raining pretty good. The grass is now turning into mud. A few ladies in the crowd and the bridesmaids' makeup is now running down the faces. My wife has taken my jacket as a cover from the rain. They finish the vows and kiss. and then everyone runs to the house and garage to get out of the rain. Oh, remember how I said the grass was now mud? Yay. Lots of people slipped and fell in the mud on the way to the house. We got to the house. Many people looked terrible from the running makeup, muddy clothing, and soaking wet. Few of the women had to cover their chests and waists due to wet clothing becoming see-through. Most of the men were loaning their coats to the ladies to cover up. Dirty looks all around. The wedding cake was outside and now brought in. The rain made the decorations on the cake turn all runny and it looks horrible. The bride and groom began to cut the cake and feed each other. They smashed the cake pieces into each other's faces. Dads then began a food fight with each other. My friend's wife got hit in the face with purple icing cake on her face and dress. The priest got hit with yellow icing on his white robe. There was nothing left of the cake to serve. Food being served was still frozen and the middle of the food and the stuff that was not frozen was burned. The dessert was supposed to be the cake, but as said above, there was nothing left. There was a goodie bag that people got on the way out. Had a lollipop, a coupon for ice cream cone at McDonald's, a pencil with the bride and groom name on it, and Halloween size M&Ms. My wife, whose dress was filthy, her makeup was out of whack, and her hair was a mess, said to me that she does not want to see those people again for 6 months. She was so mad. The couple divorced 11 months later when the groom came home from work and found his wife getting double teamed by 2 guys. Probably my own. We had planned a lovely wedding, but when it came time to actually put plans into motion I realized there was no way in hell my family and his family needed to be within several miles of each other, much less the same venue. We decided we'd get married, just the 2 of us and the gentleman responsible for the paperwork. Planned a lovely little picnic type event. Our minister was a dear friend. We told him to bring his wife and we'd treat them to lunch afterwards, at a local duck pond that has a pretty gazebo we could use. The morning of, and we apparently stepped into monsoon season. 20% chance of rain in the forecast had turned to 16 inches of rain overnight, with more on the way. We almost couldn't leave our house because the water was so high. I call a friend and tell him to scratch the duck pond idea. Can he just meet us in town so nobody gets washed away? Well, we also run a farm, so the easiest common ground that we all knew how to get there was the local feed store. Hubby and I arrive early, go inside and buy the feed we needed. As we come out, friend arrives and helps hubby load feed into the back of our truck. Still pouring rain. I hear something and see a 4 or 5 week old kitten about to get washed into a storm drain, so I grab it, wrap it in my jacket, and place it in the passenger seat of our truck before climbing into friend's Honda Element. We say our vows, sitting in the back seat, soaking wet and covered in hay and mud, and go our separate ways afterwards. Hubby learns we have a new cat. It was a cluster duck from beginning to end, but somehow it was perfect and we have a hell of a story to tell our son someday. TLDR. Got married in a flooded Tractor Supply parking lot after loading feed and rescuing a cat. Worked at a very high-end golf club in Seattle that regularly hosted expensive weddings. This Samoan wedding is probably my favorite. All the groomsmen were wearing lime green vests with matching lime green snapbacks. The wedding party must order food from the restaurant at the golf club, as stated in the contract. They order Domino's instead and the pizza guy literally brings these people pizza as they sit in a fancy restaurant. The bride and groom got into a fist fight right before the ceremony, delaying it a bit until bruises could be covered with makeup. They hired a live band to play at the reception, but didn't feed them. During their first break, the lead singer decides to zoom down the hill to grab some McDonald's for the crew. He is pulled over and arrested for drunk driving. His one call from jail: I can't play at your wedding anymore. I'm in jail. Edit. Broom to groom. That made me laugh. My aunt married her 3rd husband in Waffle House in Atlanta, Georgia. They chose the booth where Kid Rock was once arrested. Wasn't trashy, but I'm Australian and I married an Italian. Our venue offered open bar including spirits here in Italy. You can't really get that in a US without paying an arm and a leg, and there is a reason why. They were not prepared for the Australians. My small army of 20 or so friends drunk the equivalent of plus 300 people. The venue ran out and the guy who organized it reckons he made a loss. Until that day all the Italians thought I was the loosest cunt they had seen. Then they learnt I am the quiet one of the group. A friend of mine hired me to play music with him at a ceremony, but as is customary in those situations, I didn't know who was getting married until they showed up. Here's the backstory. My wife was working for a corporation and one of her team members was a guy who was happily married to his high school sweetheart and had 2 young daughters. Another of their co-workers was his best friend, who was single. Let's call the married guy Phil, his wife Kim, and his BFF Tim. Tim was a short, mousy kind of guy who had trouble getting dates, though Phil and Kim used to bring him along as situations where he'd normally be a third wheel, going sailing, going out to eat at nice restaurants, and so on. Phil didn't mind cause Tim was such a good friend and he felt bad that he was lonely. So one time Phil is going out of town and he suggests that Kim and Tim keep each other company while he's gone. Well, that's exactly what they did. And when Phil got back, his high school sweetheart announced that she and Tim were now an item and he was no longer in the picture. So imagine my surprise when the wedding couple shows up and Tim comes up to say hello to me. The cringiest part of the whole thing was Tim bringing Phil's daughters up during the wedding vows and talking about how he loved them like his own and how he was going to take care of them, etc. Those poor little girls looked like they wanted to crawl under a rock and die. The groom is a plumber. The flowers the men wore on their lapels were mini toilets with flowers in them. The centerpieces were plungers. No, I'm not making this up. When my cousin got married to his pregnant girlfriend, her father carried a shotgun when he walked her down the aisle. Mine. We had a baby on the way, so changed our plans to save money. We had a registry due in the center of town. Our ceremony was delayed when there was a suicide scare in the building with some dude from another party out on the window ledge. Afterwards we literally walked 200 meters up the road to the pub. Bought everyone a round of drinks. Then we walked across town to a nice restaurant we had booked. We didn't ask for gifts, only asked that people pay for their meal. We bought another round of drinks in the restaurant. The wedding cake was in the only corner of the restaurant where there was room. So I had to squeeze in behind her for the obligatory cake cutting pictures. All the pictures look like I am bending her over the table and giving her a good seeing too. My parents were dismayed. I thought it was ducking hilarious. After the meal we walked a little further to a church that had been converted into a nightclub. I had my first dance with my wife to some Britney Spears techno mashup. People kept buying me whiskey. I had to carry my exhausted wife, wedding dress and all, piggyback style to the nearest taxi rank to go home. Her shoes had mangled her feet. Do you know what? I'd do it the same way again. It was a ducking fantastic day, and I was able to take the full 2 weeks off work when the baby arrived without worrying about money. Edit. Remembered that I married her on her birthday, so that makes presents easier to do. I am ducking screwed if I ever forget though. I was at a wedding in Germany once, and the bride asked for a divorce during the reception. The bride and groom weren't actually very interested in each other. He was very wealthy and she needed financial stability. Didn't matter from who. He needed emotional stability afforded by marriage. It didn't matter from who. She was, maybe still is, having an affair with someone else, who just so happens to be one of her teachers from high school. He knows and doesn't care. They got married anyway and it was awkward because only the friends of the couple knew what was actually going on. Here's the kicker. The bride specifically requested that the DJ play Panic at the Disco's I Write Sins Not Tragedies. Well, I woke up in the frost out the back after playing bartender all night and drinking with every person who ordered a drink. That was about the most trashed I've been at a wedding. Edit reread thread title and realized I ducked up, leaving it here anyway. I once helped cater a hunting themed wedding, complete with camo print dress and tuxedos. It was in a public park, which in itself is not an issue at all. The reception was in a small shelter house that was made of cinder brick and was basically a room attached to 2 bathrooms, 2 public park bathrooms, with all the atmosphere you'd expect in such a place. The wedding was right outside the latrine shelter house, and consisted of the bride's mother ordering us all, while waving her arms like a maniac conductor, to hum Here Comes the Bride. The reception after was deli sandwiches, again, on its own not an issue, with Boone's Farm wine to make toasts, except if you wanted some. It was $1. Yeah. Rich French people where we didn't know anyone and despite costing major coin, there were 2 tiers of invitees. Those that got orange juice peanuts for snack food and those that got the real it, like champagne and finger sandwiches. The cocktail party was literally on two sides of a courtyard and people who didn't get the champagne had to stay to one side. Easily my cousins. It was held in their side yard. Styrofoam stuff for the aisle. She was about half an hour late coming out of the house because they had to deal with some critter. And we had to bring our own lawn chairs to sit in. Ceremony lasted all of 4 minutes and we went home. The groom showed up in a Hooters t-shirt. Turns out they had actually been divorced for 6 months at the time of the ceremony. The bride celebrated her honeymoon by checking herself into a mental hospital the day after the ceremony. My grandmother-in-law went to a giraffe-themed wedding for a guy with 3 baby mamas and an uncountable amount of kids. The bride and bridesmaids were in giraffe print dresses. There was also a giraffe cake and various sized giraffe ornaments scattered about. My wife had been married before and had the pretty and standard style ceremony. So she told me our wedding was entirely up to me. This was her mistake. So our ceremony starts out traditionally enough. I have a friend dressed as a priest, giving the most absolutely droll and boring introduction that he can. After 2 minutes of this, the actual legal officiant in the audience puts on a luchador mask and walks up to the podium. He places the priest in a headlock and physically throws him out of the room. He then pulls a smutty comic book out of his pants and proceeds to officiate the wedding from it. I had pasted a pre-written script inside. I pretend to be aghast, while my best man starts playing I'm Awesome by Spose. Then I reveal that my suit is a tearaway stripper one. And I'm wearing silk suit pajamas underneath and a This Is What Awesome Looks Like t-shirt. The scripted ceremony proceeds with several self-deprecating jokes, including the priest asking her, do you take this man to be your husband despite, well, everything. Yay. It was classy as duck. I was invited to a wedding where the bride had met her fiancé online and never in real life. The first time that they would ever see each other was meant to be at the altar at their wedding. Not surprisingly, the dude never showed up. No one seemed that fazed by it though. They were pretty much like, oh yeah, bummer. His flight got cancelled. We'll just proceed to the reception. Weirdest ducking thing ever. They're still dating last I heard. A woman friend needed a date for her sister's wedding. Chivalry and all. I go with her. I had met the sister and, sorry, but she's as dumb as a mud puddle. And she is Einstein compared to the groom. They had written their own vows. Bride goes first. A bunch of spacey, love on a cosmic astral plane stuff that makes no sense at all. Really is a bad version of a 60s hippie acid trip. No continuity. Absolutely weird. Groom starts his vows. It was basically I really love you stuff. Not too bad. Until the end. His big joke finish was us until fat do us part. It was supposed to be the big laugh. He stood there with a big grin, waiting for the laugh. Dead. Horrified. Silence. Bride and groom walk down the aisle. Bride's mascara streaming down her cheeks from crying. Bride's mother red-faced with fury. At the reception the mother gets stupid drunk. Bride is going from one person to the next apologizing for everything. Groom is whooping it up, having a good old time, oblivious to everything. Woman I'm with was deeply embarrassed, then finally had enough drinks in her to start chuckling a little bit. In Uganda, they have this thing called Ugandan time. Anything, for example, appointment. Even if you're the one who made it or has to attend it, Ugandans will always be late, at least a few hours. We attended a Ugandan wedding of a co-worker of my dad's. Everybody there besides us and this American couple were Ugandan. The Americans and us came first. The Ugandans all attended the wedding 4 hours after it was made to start. The bride and groom, the ducking people who made the wedding, came 6 hours later. The best man said in his speech, here's to toddlers and condoms, 2 things you shouldn't ever duck with. My mom's 5th. It was a BBQ grill out. The preacher showed up, shared a beer with the groom. They sat in lawn chairs and insulted minorities for a bit. Groom asked if he could say his vows from said lawn chair. Mom said no. After the vows we had to make our own food if we were hungry. Groom pulled out his phone and began looking up football scores. My mom sat at the table alone with the cake. I got the hell out of there. I was at a punk wedding in some village. The groom had a suit. She had a white dress, but they both had some high heels like Steele's or Martin's. After the ceremony and some usual wedding things, there was a punk rock concert with several bands instead of some regular wedding band playing dancing stuff. It was all outside and it was raining. Mud everywhere. I was playing guitar in one of those bands. It was cool and fun, but I guess it could be considered trashy. This was this past summer in Mississippi. My girlfriend's aunt was getting married for the third time to the cousin of her second husband, who I'm pretty sure was in jail at the time. The location was one of those roadside churches you pass by in bumduck southern states. We arrived 5 minutes before the event only to find out the bride wasn't there yet and was still getting ready in her hotel room. When she did pull up in her sister's car, she quickly put out her cigarette and rushed into a private room and put her veil on. The wedding then began. It was a small service and lasted about 30 minutes, including 3 separate times where a different country love song, not sure what they were, would be played over the PA system and the bride and groom would just stare at each other awkwardly. When the service was finally over, we convened to church's kitchen for boxes of Walmart fried chicken and Mountain Dew. My cousin had a hunting themed wedding once. He wore a camo suit jacket and everything. Shortly after the reception started, his bride was hammered drunk. At one point I walked into the restroom and the bride and her maids were in there. One of the bridesmaids asked if the barbecue beans were giving anyone gas, to which the bride responded, "Oh yeah, I've got gas," so loud that the whole reception heard. Never been more entertained by a wedding, I don't think. A tale of 2 weddings. A couple weeks apart. Attended a coastal elite gay wedding and a Trumpland straight wedding in a small farming town. The straight wedding was a large church wedding. I was one of 3 people wearing a suit, the other 2 being the groom and his grandfather. Groomsmen wore vests. Most people wore jeans. Some even wore printed t-shirts. The highlight of the reception was the best man telling crude jokes, the theme of which was marriage sucks, ball and chain, etc. That was the ugliest part. I'll admit that dinner was served on styrofoam plates because money is not the contrast I am focusing on. That was the trashiest wedding. The gay wedding was at a fancy hotel on a cliff over the ocean. Picture perfect. But what set it apart wasn't all show and money. The grooms wrote their own vows, which were deeply romantic and moving and brought people to tears. Especially notable were remarks of the mother of one of the grooms, who was there against the wishes of her very religious husband, boycotting his own son's wedding. The contrast spoke volumes about the sanctity of marriage. This was a friend of my ex's, so I really don't know how they met, but he was a truck driver in his 50s and she was a 30-something-year-old stripper. The flower girl was the bride's daughter from a previous relationship. They had a ceremony at a local church which wasn't too bad. Actually pretty nice church. But the reception was at an old country buffet. The trashy part was the families of the bride and groom. It was just a rowdy crowd, and some sort of altercation broke out towards the end that made me fear for my life. I was 18. They divorced a few months later. It was the bride's 3rd wedding, but there was no bar or toast at the reception because she wasn't 21 yet. My sister's, her husband's mother wore a tracksuit to the wedding. The kicker is the tracksuit looked like it was from the 90s. Edit husbands. It wasn't trashy because of anything the couple did, but, my friend walks down the aisle and the pastor is drunk. So he starts off with "We are here to celebrate the love between Daniel and what's her face," and it just goes downhill from there. I have never laughed at so many weird references in a ceremony before or after. He talked about not letting her uncle interfere in their sex life and how it was a marriage bed, not a marriage couch or kitchen table.